And when we're thinking about breakout roster signings, when we've been doing this for the other previews, we've heard about different player acquisitions, or we've talked about like, oh, this was a player that was re-signed, or a player who was issued a contract extension. But what I'm going to do here for San Diego Wave FC is because basically all of them I think you can make an argument for breakout roster signings because it was players joining the team for the first time. So Lisa, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to rattle these off, and I'm going to hit you with a question. Are you ready?
I am ready. Hit me.
All right. So in terms of breakout roster signings, player acquisitions, of which there were many, Abby Dahlkemper, defender, the first signing for San Diego Wave. They made a move for Alex Morgan. Mana Shim included in this roster as a non-roster invitee. Sofia Jakobsson via Bayern Munich. Swedish International, Kailen Sheridan. Tegan McGrady, Jody Taylor, a triple trade with Chicago Red Stars, Katie Johnson, Mackenzie Donia, Kelsey Turnbow coming via Chicago, acquiring Carly Telford off a transfer from Chelsea FC, and there's some things that are pending there on her international transfer certificate and P1 visa, the expansion draft that came into play, ultimately selecting Kristen McNabb, Kaylee Real, and then the draft itself, right? Going with the number 1 overall pick in Naomi Girma, Marlene Schimmer, Sydney Pulver, Belbrid, Caleb Bruce, a ton of players that they started to add, right, as the off-season window came into play. When you're looking at just some of these, Lisa, what are some of the players that ring out to you that you can point at and say, you know what, that can be considered the breakout roster signing for this team?
I mean, all of them, right? In some sense, you can really see, I think, the personal touches from head coach Casey Stoney, President Jill Ellis. I think you can really see where their personal touches and personal interests in this roster come in based on who they've signed. I think that making the first move with Abby Dahlkemper and that first signing was really telling of what kind of team San Diego is going to be. And we actually, Sandra, you and I had the pleasure of speaking with head coach Casey Stoney a bit back, way back when all of this was first initially announced. And that was something she said, that she wants to be a defensive team that is really tough to break down, a team that has the ball on defense and then immediately starts their attack. But it all starts with defense, and it's team defending from the forwards to their back. So I think signing Abby Dahlkemper as the very first signing is pretty big. I also really like their gets of Kailen Sheridan, right? Gotham goalkeeper, Canadian international, gold medal last summer in Tokyo. So looking at it defensively, those are some big signings for sure. And Carly Telford, a transfer out of Chelsea, the goalkeeper as well. I like this. Even Tegan McGrady from Washington Spirit, the NWSL champions from 2021. I think the defense that Casey Stoney acquired is really telling of kind of what system she's going to set up in the back and how she is putting her money where her mouth is. And she said she wants to be a defensive team. So she went out and found some of the top defensive players in the world to come to her squad. So that's really what stands out to me when I look at all of these signings and even glancing down the roster. What about you? Were any of these signings surprising? Maybe surprising that they left their initial team that they were with, or the fact that they did come to San Diego? Does anything stand out to you on that front?
You know what? I liked the signing of Sofia Jakobsson, right? Via Bayern, via the Swedish International coming over to the States and going to be playing with an expansion side, right? As the concept of having this sort of veteran international player coming on board overseas to not only the NWSL, but to a club that is really just getting things started, really stood out for me a lot. It also really sort of signaled, what somebody like a Casey Stoney, like who she is and what she is bringing, right, to this team. So this combination, this sort of 1-2 punch between, Stoney and Downton, and Ellis, and their scouting ability, right, and their ability to sort of go out there and sell a team and say like, hey, come on board, right? So that stood out for me a lot. Obviously, I think the big headline was somebody like an Alex Morgan, right? coming into the fold, right? The California native herself coming into the fold for San Diego, but the whole concept of like joining a third expansion side technically, right? So I guess maybe there's an argument there for the Thorns, and that they were in since the beginning in 2013, but they were still an inaugural team in an inaugural league, right? So that's being a part of the Thorns in 2013, the Pride in 2015, and now in 2021 and Alex Morgan. So I think there's a ton here when we're rattling off these moves that I just sort of rattled off, that you can maybe make a case for almost each one. But I'm with you on the defensive signing of things, right? It signals a little bit of what Stoney was talking to us about, but I like how they sort of brought in and how they targeted certain players to sort of come into the fold. But because we are like looking at an expansion team, right? We're sort of highlighting the roster overall in a sense, right? When it comes to signings or breakout signings. And it's sort of, we had a little bit of a chuckle about it because we were like, well, what are we going to talk about a little bit when we get into most detrimental or biggest losses, right? And we're going to crack a joke here, but I'm going to say allocation money, maybe, right? Maybe not a player per se, although there was some player movement for San Diego, but there was a lot of allocation money for this franchise coming and going, right? 275,000 for Alex Morgan to the Orlando Pride, going through the expansion draft and selecting Chrissy Mewis, but then ultimately trading her to Gotham FC, receiving 200,000 in allocation money, and then acquiring Taylor Korniak and Emily Van Eggen from the Pride for what? More allocation money, right? So I was just like, well, maybe the something like a loss, quote unquote, could be allocation money. We definitely saw that come into play for this franchise side.
I think it's really smart. That's what I meant earlier when I said that you can see Casey Stoney and Jill Ellis's influence on this team already, because not only the international players that they've acquired, but how smart they are at doing this. I mean, Casey Stoney was formerly with Manchester United. She started with them in 2018, which was their inaugural season. And Stoney, in that very first season, won the FA Women's Championship. That title, she was then promoted to the FAWSL. She won 18 out of her 20 games. So she knows how to come in with a new team and with a new squad and kind of establish foundation and establish themselves in a league. And I think that maybe the balls, I don't know how to say this, of Casey Stoney to kind of say, okay, I'm going to draft Christy Mewis and then trade her to Gotham. She's already looking like a veteran coach in this league, which she is not. She's already playing the game that all of these other coaches are playing, and to kind of be in on that pop mix as well with the Abby Dahlkemper trade. Remember, Abby Dahlkemper in the middle of the 2021 season went to Houston for just a few months to then be traded back to North Carolina, her name rights only, ultimately to be traded to San Diego. So that's really smart of Casey Stoney. We're seeing a lot of what she can do on paper and in her office that will hopefully translate to the pitch, right? I mean, we're hoping, but yeah, I guess the biggest loss that they have is maybe their allocation money. Maybe Casey Stoney showing too much of her hand, saying that she's going to be such a defensive team, acquiring all these defensive players, making all these big offseason moves and really showing her hand as to how powerful she is, and knowing what she wants for the 2022 season and just going out and getting it. I think it's really promising. If you're a San Diego fan, this is pretty cool.
Well, we're talking about it in a kind of a little bit of a jokester kind of way, like in terms of like the biggest loss in their off season, right? But it's almost, you can sort of flip it and be like, that's really smart. I mean, it sort of signals that this is going to be a franchise that's not going to shy away from this concept of allocation money in the league, right? Where you can sort of borrow so much from the league to utilize. And in their first off season, just sort of going for it, sort of having the coach with that mindset to say, like, let's be aggressive with it, a club president and GMs agreeing with that, and obviously having the group in play, ownership group in place, where they're just like, yeah, like, go ahead and do that to sort of build up this club. Now that we talked about, acquisitions, losses, right? Had a couple of jokes about that. Let's maybe look at the total roster, sort of give some love to everybody that is officially a part of this preseason roster at the time, and take a look at who's gonna, potentially make a splash, right? In preseason here in front of a coaching staff. Let's start with the goalkeepers: Kailen, Sheridan, Carly Telford, Melissa Loader, Emery Wenginger or Wenninger?
Wenninger, I believe.
Okay, well, someone let us know.
All right.
I would love to get that correct. That's 4 goalkeepers for San Diego. Defenders, they've got 10 listed: Abby Dahlkemper, Naomi Girma, Kaylee Rill, Kristen McNabb, Kristen Westfall, Tika McGrady, Maya Gao, Kyla Brewster, Megan Breed, and Taylor Henson. Midfielders also with 10: Taylor Cornick, Kelsey Turnbow, Emily Van Egman, Marlene Schimmer, Sydney Pulver, Belle Breed, Melania Shim, Sydney Zandi, Taylor Porter, and forwards also rounding out with 10 with Alex Morgan, Jody Taylor, Sofia Jakobsson, Amira Ali, Katie Johnson, Mackenzie Doniak, Rue Machera, Sarah Sodoma, and Emerson Lane. So you're talking 10 forwards, 10 midfielders, 10 defenders, 4 goalkeepers, 34 players. We have a lot of love for the preseason roster that has plus 30 on them, right?
That was some easy math for us. I was doing that too. We have them listed out on our rundown as like goalkeepers 4, defenders 10. So it was easy math to go 10, 10, 10. 4. This is one of the bigger rosters that we've seen with 34 players. I think having 10 defenders is a lot of defenders for this squad to have, especially considering all of the defenders listed are backs. Not a lot of them play that 6 defensive midfield position. A lot of them are center backs or outside backs strictly. So interesting to kind of see how that will unfold. But this is a big roster. But as an expansion side in San Diego, I think they needed to have a big roster because you don't really know what you're going to get. You don't really know. I think when this roster dropped for the preseason for 2022, echoes around the Twitter sphere about Mana Shim being on this roster. I think that was the biggest star that people saw. I mean, a lot of the other signings were already named before and announced and celebrated from San Diego Wave before. It was a lot of the non-roster invites that on this list that were the most shocking, and Mana Shim being one of them. I think also some of the younger players that were called in, like Melissa Lauder. She's a goalkeeper formerly with a few different squads. She was with Kansas City, I think, for a little. She bounced around. She maybe saw 1 cap last year, but her to be a non-roster invite to the San Diego team, I think that's pretty interesting. But Mana Shim, I mean, she retired in 2019. She went to law school, good friends with Alex Morgan, living in San Diego. Hey, why not?
Why not give it a shot, right? I like that it's she's listed as a non-roster invitee. So a lot of times when players are sort of listed out along that player preseason roster as a non-roster invitee, it's about getting in the mix and kind of showing what you got and showing to the coaching staff that you can be an asset to this club. It really is about sort of kind of getting into the mix and kind of earning a contract, so to speak, right? But obviously that sort of sent out, fun alarms, I'll call them, across social media, right? Just sort of coming off of the 2021 that we all witnessed collectively together, learning about through important reporting via The Athletic about players' past experiences, right? With in toxic environments, poor playing environments, at times suffering moments of harassment. And Mana Shim was amongst several players who had come forward with sharing their stories throughout 2021. And to sort of see her right on a preseason roster almost sort of feels like as you read these articles, as you read these stories, it almost sort of feels like this kind of full story arc in a sense. So to see her on there, a lot of people noticed that immediately. But when it comes to 34 players,
but she's not the only non-roster invitee. There's 10 of them.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I was like, when we're looking at 34 players, there's a ton, right? There's always a little bit of an acronym, right? That comes in, the acronyms that come into play, a little key when you're looking at these rosters that drop during the preseason. So they say things like, CDP for like college draft pick, or NRI for like non-roster invitee, or like this whole like
NYR,
not yet reported to camps, like things like that. So there's all these little different things, but that's something else. So while we're looking at like 10 forwards, 10 midfielders, 10 defenders, there's also throughout some of this, there's actual 10 non-roster invitee as part of this preseason roster. So when we're looking at all of these players, when we sort of maybe take a look at what could be an ideal starting 11 for San Diego Wave FC. We've been doing this a lot for all of our previews, taking a look at them. It's tough in this part of this season, in this phase of the year, to look at something and say, boom, this is going to be the starting 11 for this team. It's especially harder, I think, to do that with an expansion side, right? Because we only have bits and pieces, things, conversations and interviews, right? Like you mentioned the one that we had with Casey Stoney that sort of allude to the type of soccer and the type of team that they want to be in 2022. We haven't seen it yet. So it's tough to go through these and say, like, this is going to be the starting 11 come day one. So, but let's maybe take a look at a few. Like, when you're looking at some of these names, Lisa, are there any that jump out where you're just like, this is going to be a player that's going to be on that starting 11?
I think a player like Abby Dahlkemper, defender, who was the very first signing, you don't go after a player like that and make a big deal if you're not going to play them. And I think that Abby Dahlkemper is a center back defender that you could build a back line around, because Dahlkemper has a lot of those individual skills where she can break lines with her passing, and she's a good 1v1 defender. I also think Alex Morgan, you don't go for a big name like that and not play. Even Sofia Jakobsson, a big Swedish international from Bayern, you don't go for big names if they're not necessarily going to see a lot of time on the field. Looking at this roster breakdown, I also think it's interesting that Taylor Korniak, who traded from Orlando Pride to San Diego, is listed as a midfielder because she was a midfielder in college and then went to Orlando Pride and played under Mark Skinner and became a forward. He transitioned her higher up the field, and now she's backlisted as a midfielder. So just something else interesting to kind of keep your eye on, which we could see her floating around. I mean, you're not stuck to that position if it's on the roster. So you could float around, but even like a Kailen Sheridan in goal, I think she could get time and she could start there. But otherwise, I think a lot is left to be determined from my perspective. It also depends how Casey Stoney wants to set up her formation. Are we looking at 4 backs and 4 in the midfield, or 3 in the midfield, 3 up top? A lot of different things to be seen still in the very first game. And we might not even see consistency in playing formations and playing personnel until the regular season, until a few weeks into the regular season. Me looking at this 34 player roster. For you, Sandra, any specific names jump out, or the ones I say, do you agree with? And Dahlkemper, Sheridan.
Yeah, I think you nailed it for sure. I think you can go through each each of the positions and pick out at least one that we know for sure is going to be there. So for a lock for 4 of these, different positions, Sheridan, I absolutely see start getting the start in goal. I mean, the Canadian international coming off of a gold medal in the Tokyo Games. But not only that, at this point in her career, very experienced NWSL keeper. So I don't think you, again, like you were sort of alluding to Alex Morgan, I don't think you make that kind of move for a Dahlkemper or a Morgan, or in this case, a Sheridan, and not intend to start her in net. I would love to see the rookie and Naomi Girma really kind of start to make a name for herself, talking about making a splash, right? I would like to see that. She was the first, draft pick for this team, number 1 overall. Maybe we can make that argument as well. Maybe we're like, well, maybe you don't make this pick at number one overall and not make a little bit of a commitment to this type of player, right? So I'm very curious to see. That's a lot of players and across different lines. We're under the assumption as in years past that preseason rosters have to be narrowed down, as it continues to go on, as we sort of look ahead to a Challenge Cup that is really getting closer, and we'll see who they decide to sort of roll with, and continue going on with. But I would like to see any number of those players on the starting 11.